You see, the false prophet would be speaking of this coming kingdom, this false kingdom, a lying kingdom, the kingdom of the new age. And it would be a satanic kingdom with false signs and wonders, which is what this demonic world is all about. That would be ushered in. Important to understand that, because the Aquarian conspiracy is about the ushering in of the New Age movement. And Marilyn Ferguson, this book was at the top for several months at the New York Times best-selling list when it came out. And she points out the importance of psychedelic drugs to initiate people into New Age thought in the 1960s. And she says this. She says it's impossible to overestimate the historic role. It's impossible to overestimate the historic role. You can't really overestimate the historic role of drugs in the 60s, of getting people into the New Age movement. Here's what she says. For a great many, the trigger, that is the trigger that's brought people to New Age consciousness and a New Age worldview, and to changing their worldview from a Christian worldview over to an Eastern worldview. For a great many, the trigger has been a spontaneous, mystical, or psychic experience. How did that happen? A spontaneous, mystical, or psychic experience. When you speak of a mystical or psychic experience, what kind of experience are we talking about? Spiritual experiences. How? She says, as hard to explain as it is to deny, or the intense alternative reality generated by a psychedelic drug. It is impossible to overestimate the historic role of psychedelics as an entry point drawing people into other transformative technologies. For tens of thousands, she says, the drugs were a path to Xanadu, especially in the 1960s. So even in the 1960s, with those who did not continue in with mushrooms and LSD and cocaine and these other drugs, these things initiated them, marijuana, a milder hallucinogen. They introduced them into a new worldview, which became the New Age worldview. Tens of thousands of these hippies. These are the people now running the United States of America. In fact, Newsweek had an article a while back on President Clinton called the New Age President. You know? And, you know, he's admitted at least by now to smoking marijuana, even though he didn't inhale it, you know. But we got to realize what's behind this. The demonic world is behind this. Now, we just read where Albert Hoffman said, man, there's a correlation that's worth investigating. And we just read where Marilyn Ferguson said that it was through these drugs. They didn't get into these drugs because they had already adopted an Eastern lifestyle for the most part, but it was through these drugs, right, that they were opened up to what? The New Age mindset. Very, very important. Now, if we're going to understand the drug revolution that our nation is so wiped out by, and so many people are being deceived by, and that the Word of God tells us would be an epidemic in the last days, we have to understand a little bit about who's the main guy. I mean, when I've mentioned Albert Hoffman's name, the one who discovered LSD, and we're going to get back at him in a little bit, only one hand was raised. Who is the main guy when you think of the drug revolution? Whose name comes to your mind? Timothy Leary. He was a Harvard professor who passed out drugs like the hallucinogens at Harvard University as a lecturer, professor of psychotherapy and psychology, who passed it out to his students like guinea pigs. He passed them out like little candies, taking advantage of the youth. You know, young people, immature, and just used them, man, as so many guinea pigs for his demonic experiments. And Leary became the main instigator on an intellectual level. In fact, another Harvard professor worked with him in those experiences, in those experiments, Richard Alpert. And, yeah, well, he became a guru. See, through his drug experiences, he ended up becoming a Hindu guru, you see. And what's interesting about that is what was he initiating himself into? Eastern mystical thought, spiritism. You see, because he was receiving, and we'll get into him, a couple quotes from him as well in a little bit. But it's interesting that Timothy Leary with turn on, remember the turn on, tune in, and what? Drop out. That was coined by Timothy Leary. And it became the mantra that was repeated millions and millions of times by the hippie movement through the 60s as they turned on and tuned in and they dropped out. Now, and many of them literally dropped out of life. In fact, John Lennon pushed Leary's thought and obviously was in his own right doing his own deal. In fact, Lennon wrote a song called Come Together. Anybody remember that? Do you know that was a campaign song for Timothy Leary's presidency? Thank God Timothy Leary didn't become president. Although we have a Timothy Leary as president right now, it seems. Continuing on. John Lennon, the Beatles, wrote Come Together for his presidential campaign. Timothy Leary was a follower of, and now this is important because you have to understand more than Timothy Leary to understand this. Timothy Leary was a follower of Aleister Crowley. Okay? In time, he became a follower of Aleister Crowley because he recognized that their teachings were very similar. And this is very important to understand because one of the founding fathers of the hippie movement ended up being a follower of the most highly regarded Satanist of this century. Okay, this is very important to understand. Following Crowley's teaching. Timothy Leary followed his teachings and believed he was fulfilling Crowley's mission. In fact, let me quote the Book of the Law, which was given to Aleister Crowley by a spirit identified as Satan, and it was written in 1904, published a few years later. And the book was called the Book of the Law, and it was to introduce and bring in what Crowley called the new eon. Many of you know this from seeing the rock and roll presentation. Crowley was trying to introduce the new eon, or he believed the spirits that were communicating to him were trying to bring in the new eon. The new eon, eon is a Greek transliteration of the word that means what? Age. Okay? Ionis. So Crowley wanted to bring in the new age. And here's one of Crowley's laws in the Book of the Law. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Right? Do what thou wilt. In the 1960s, that became what? Do your own thing. Or if it feels good, do it. But Crowley, by the way, as we know, was a Satanist. Like Echoes from Eden, Crowley wrote this, or this was given to him in his Book of the Law. Quote, listen, I am the snake that giveth knowledge. What does that make you think of right there? Makes you think of the Garden of Eden. But now look what he says further on. I am the snake that giveth knowledge and delight and bright glory, and stir the hearts of men with drunkenness. To worship me, take wine and strange drugs, wherever I will tell my prophet and be drunk thereof. Now, in 1904, were a lot of people taking strange drugs? You know, that's before Aldous Huxley was using drugs. Long before Leary. I am the snake that giveth knowledge, the Garden of Eden. To worship me, one of the things you do is take strange drugs. You see, and he'll give you that knowledge, just like the serpent in Eden. Are you following this so far? Now, Leary hooked into this stuff, man, because listen to this. Leary said of Crowley in his book, Flashbacks, a autobiography, properly titled, he writes this on page, and here's the book, and I have the sources for most of the quotes I'm giving you in book form. Like I said, I've been researching this for quite a while. Listen to what he says. Crowley was an original member of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. In 1904, he claimed to have established telepathic communication with a higher intelligence through the medium of his wife, Rosemary. He foresaw the beginning of the new eon, to which he attributed these aphorisms. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law, and every man and every woman is a star. Over the next 2 decades, he experimented with every available drug as a means of transcendence. In 1910, Crowley developed the extract of peyote, pretty heavy, which he brought back to England and used to turn on the audiences at his lectures. Crowley produced a flood of articles and books on spiritual subjects, devising a new tarot, the Book of Thoth, tarot cards. And it goes on. Now, Leary believed that he was the fulfillment of Aleister Crowley's mission to bring the world into New Age consciousness. Now, we know that Crowley admitted, if you look at his autohagiography, he admits that he personally sought to contact Satan personally and become his chief of staff. He wanted to usher in Satan's kingdom. Now listen to this. This is what Leary says about Crowley. This is on a PBS interview, which if you want documentation on it, get the Rock and Roll Sorcerer video and we actually play it for you so you can see it. He says, I've been an admirer of Aleister Crowley. I think I've been carrying out his work he started 100 years ago. I think the 60s themselves. See, in the 1940s, Crowley wrote in his autohagiography that in 1940s he said America